Nobody on the Osuvane Vantal had ever conducted a first contact assessment in the rain. That fact alone should have been enough of a warning. It was not. If you're new to this archive, this is where we catalog the moments a low-tier species accidentally terrifies the rest of the galaxy, and humans are, without question, our most consistent offenders. Hit subscribe now because the reports only get stranger from here. And drop a comment with your guess. What does a rugby club actually do when a spaceship lands on its pitch on a Saturday night? I promise you will not guess it. Now back to the fun. Warnings, in my experience, are only useful to people who are looking for them. And Director Kaylee's Thorne was absolutely not looking for warnings. She was looking for a clean survey, a quiet planet, and the kind of uneventful report that gets you promoted off deep space rotation and into an office with a window. My name is Vex Solmara, Xenological Assessment Officer, 3rd Contact Division, Osuvane Survey Fleet. 14 years in this seat. 14 years of watching low-tier planets react to first contact with panic, worship, or, on one memorable occasion, an entire continent's power grid failing simultaneously out of sheer collective shock. I had cataloged 41 species' first reactions to seeing us: screaming, fainting, religious conversion twice, mass evacuation. One species tried to eat the shuttle. There was a pattern to it, is what I mean. Fear, or awe, or some combination of the two, expressed in ways that were, if nothing else, legible. You could plot it on a graph. You could write a training manual around it, and we had several, and I had personally revised Chapter 9 of the current edition, the one on managing initial panic response, twice. I had never cataloged what happened in a rugby club car park in a town called Pint or something, in a region of the target planet designated, according to our charts, as *Wales*. I am not certain Chapter 9 survives contact with it. I have recommended, in fact, that Chapter 9 be quietly retired, and I will explain why by the end of this report. I should start at the beginning because the report requires it, and because if I do not put this in order now, I am fairly sure I never will. The descent was routine. That is the word I wrote in the log, and I want it on record that I stand by it, technically. The shuttle came down in a scouting pattern designed to avoid population centers, agricultural land, and anything resembling infrastructure. Our sensors indicated an open, flat, grass-covered area with minimal structural density and low light pollution, ideal for a discrete touchdown. Our sensors did not indicate that the flat, grass-covered area was a rugby pitch. Nor did they indicate that it was 9:47 p.m. on a Saturday, that the match had finished 40 minutes earlier, or that low structural density meant one clubhouse, one floodlight rig, and a car park containing, by my later count, 31 vehicles and 4 motorbikes. We landed 60 meters from the clubhouse door. The engines made a sound our specifications describe as acoustically negligible at range. This was not true. It was true at distances greater than 200 meters. At 60 meters on a quiet Saturday night, it was the loudest thing that had happened in Penter since, according to a sign we later photographed for the archive, the 1987 Cup Final. Director Thorne's first order was standard protocol: full concealment, no engagement, observe for 48 hours minimum before any contact decision. This is Section 4, Subsection 2 of the Osuvane First Contact Code. It has worked with minor variation on every world we have surveyed. It did not survive first contact with the clubhouse door. The door opened 94 seconds after our landing. A human male walked out. He was, according to our on-site measurements, 1.9 meters tall, built along the general lines of a supply crate, and wearing what our archive would later identify as a rugby shirt in a shade of red the color-matching database still cannot settle on a name for. He was holding a pint glass in one hand. He looked directly at our shuttle, which was, I want to be very clear about this, under full active camouflage, rated for concealment against species with visual acuity 3 grades above baseline human. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned back toward the clubhouse door and shouted, "Gareth, someone's landed a bloody spaceship on the 22." I looked at Director Thorne. Director Thorne looked at the concealment readout, which showed 100% functional cloaking, then looked at the human, then looked at me. "He should not be able to see us," she said. "No," I agreed. "Nothing on this planet's technological index suggests they should be able to see us." "No," I agreed again, because I did not yet have a better answer, and I would not have one for several more hours. A Seiko. ND human appeared in the doorway. Female, shorter, built with the compact, coiled density of someone who does something physically dangerous for recreation. She had a rugby ball tucked under one arm the way other species carry a data tablet, absently, as though she had simply forgotten to put it down. She looked at the shuttle. "Oh," she said, "right." That was the entirety of her reaction. "Oh, right." I have reviewed 41 first contact events. I have never seen a species process the arrival of an interstellar craft with less apparent alarm than the word "oh." Protocol at this point calls for immediate recloaking recalibration and tactical withdrawal to orbit. Director Thorne gave the order. I relayed it to the pilot. The pilot, a junior officer named Brennies, who I will be mentioning again later under less flattering circumstances, informed us that recalibration required 40 minutes, and that in the meantime we remained, in his words, extremely visible to anyone who happens to be standing there already. Which, as it turned out, was now 11 humans, all of whom had come out of the clubhouse to look at us, several of whom were holding pint glasses, and one of whom, the woman with the rugby ball, who I would later learn was named Gwen Pritchard, club captain, second row forward, and I now believe the single most consequential individual in this entire report, was walking toward the shuttle. "You can't just walk toward it," said the large man from before, whose name turned out to be Di. He said this the way one might say you can't just pet the wasp nest, which is to say, as a formality, not as an argument he expected to win. "It's on our pitch," said Gwen. "I want to see what it did to the 22-meter line. I want to note for the record that this, the condition of a painted line on a grass field, was, as far as I can determine from the full transcript of the evening Gwen Pritchard's asterisk primary, concern regarding the arrival of an alien spacecraft. Not the craft, not its occupants, the line." She reached the shuttle's landing struts. She crouched down and examined the scorched grass with the focused, irritated expression of a groundskeeper assessing frost damage. I later learned that the 22-meter line in question had, according to the clubhouse notice board, been repainted only 9 days prior, by Gwen personally, on a Sunday morning, which I believe explains a great deal about the priority ordering she was about to demonstrate. Then she stood, put both hands on her hips, and addressed the hull directly, in a tone I can only describe as the tone one uses on a delivery driver who has parked across your driveway. "You're going to want to move that before Tuesday," she said. "We've got training." Director Thorne, listening through the hull sensors, turned to me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her in 14 years of service. "Is she talking to the ship," Director Thorne said, "or to us?" "I believe both," I said. "Open a channel." I want it noted that I advised against this. I want it noted that Director Thorne overruled me in 11 seconds, which is a personal record for how quickly she has ever overruled a direct procedural objection. The exterior speaker activated. Director Thorne, through the translation matrix, delivered what I can only describe as the finest first contact address in the history of the Osuvane survey fleet. Calm, formal, historically significant, the kind of speech that gets carved onto commemorative plaques. "Greetings," the shuttle said, in Gwen Pritchard's own recently sampled dialect, rendered with what our matrix rated as 97% phonetic accuracy. "We are travelers from beyond your solar system. We mean you no harm. We ask that you remain calm and maintain a safe distance while we..." "Come in for a pint then," Gwen said. There was a pause. I have this pause on the recording. It is 3.2 seconds long, and I believe it represents the exact moment 14 years of Director Thorne's operational training quietly gave up. "I beg your pardon," the shuttle said. "You've had a long flight," Gwen said, entirely reasonably, as if this explained something. "Bars still open. Sion's on till 10:30. Behind her, Dai had already turned and was walking back toward the clubhouse, apparently satisfied that the matter of the spacecraft was, for the moment, adequately handled by his captain, and that the more pressing issue was his pint going flat. I have been asked in the drafting of this report to justify why a first contact vessel under full defensive protocol proceeded to disembark 3 crew members, unarmed, into an unsecured civilian structure, 41 minutes after landing, on the invitation of a woman primarily concerned about a painted line on a field. My answer, which I stand behind, is Director Thorne wanted to see what would happen. I want that on the record too. I advised caution. I was overruled. I have been overruled. Great deal in the writing of this report, and it will happen several more times before the end. The clubhouse was, per our environmental scan, 4 degrees Celsius warmer than the outside air, heavily saturated with volatile organic compounds we later identified as ethanol, sweat, and something called a pasty, and populated by approximately 40 humans, none of whom, once the initial excitement of there is a spaceship on the 22 had worn off, which took, by my count, 6 minutes, treated our arrival as an event requiring any further comment. We were seated at a table near the bar. A man named Ianto, who I understood to be some manner of ceremonial officer for the club, referred to throughout the evening as social sec, brought us 3 drinks without being asked what we wanted, which Director Thorne found deeply alarming from a threat assessment standpoint, and which I have since come to understand is simply how the establishment operates. "What's in it?" Director Thorne asked, examining the glass. "Best not to ask, love," said Ianto, and walked away. Director Thorne did not drink it. I wanted on the record that I did, in a professional capacity, as a xenological sampling exercise, and that my subsequent readings, elevated heart rate, mild vasodilation, a 12% increase in vocal volume over the following 90 minutes, have been submitted separately to the medical division and should not be taken as representative of standard ossuvein physiology under normal operating conditions. It was during this period that Dai sat down across from us, uninvited, and asked Director Thorne to arm wrestle. I need to explain who Dai was, because he becomes structurally important to this report. Dai Rees-Morgan was, we later learned, the club's loosehead prop, a position which, as far as I have been able to determine through extensive post-event research, exists specifically to allow one human to push against several other humans at once using primarily his neck. He was 1.94 meters tall. He weighed, per a scale we borrowed from the clubhouse kitchen under the pretense of scientific interest, 118 kilograms, the overwhelming majority of which did not appear to be anything a medical scanner would classify as fat. Director Thorne is 1.6 meters tall and, per ossuvein physiological averages, weighs approximately 44 kilograms. "I would not do that," I said. "Why not?" said Director Thorne, who had had 1.5 of the unidentified drinks by this point and was, I believe, feeling the early effects of what our medical division would later term diplomatic overconfidence. "Because he weighs nearly 3 times what you do. I have a doctorate in xenological command strategy. He has a neck that appears to be load-bearing." Director Thorne arm-wrestled Dai Rees-Morgan. I have the footage. It lasted 1.4 seconds. Director Thorne's arm was placed flat against the table with a speed that our own combat assessment division, upon reviewing the tape weeks later, described in an internal memo as concerning, mostly for what it implies about the rest of the roster we have not yet tested. Dai did not gloat. This is important. He simply nodded, said, "Good grip, though," and bought her another drink, which she also did not touch, on the grounds that she was, in her words, reassessing several assumptions. An older man at the next table, who I later learned was called Emmer and had, per the framed photographs behind the bar, played for the club some 30 years prior, leaned over at this point and offered Director Thorne what he clearly believed was a comforting piece of wisdom. "Don't feel bad, love," he said. "He had my shoulder out of its socket in '94 and I bought him a pint after. That's rugby, see? You lose the arm wrestle, you don't lose the evening." Director Thorne stared at him for a long moment. "Your shoulder was dislocated," she said, "and you purchased him a beverage." "Well, it wasn't his fault my footing was bad. He caused you a documented physical injury. And I've told that story at every wedding I've been to since. Best thing that ever happened to me, that shoulder." He raised his glass slightly, as if in tribute to the joint in question, and returned to his conversation with no apparent awareness that he had said anything remarkable. I made a note in my log. I have made a great many notes in my log tonight. This one reads, in full. Subject appears to have reclassified a significant physical injury as a treasured social memory. Recommend further study before we assume we understand this species' relationship to harm at all. At approximately 10:15 p.m., a portion of the room began to sing. I want to describe this properly because nothing in our cultural database prepared me for it. There was no announcement. There was no cue that I could detect. One voice began, I believe it was Ianto's, low, in a minor key, singing words our translation matrix flagged as archaic regional confid. And says 61%. Within 11 seconds, the entire room had joined, in what our acoustic analysis subsequently confirmed was four-part harmony, produced spontaneously, without rehearsal, by a room that 30 minutes prior had been arguing loudly about whether someone named Wynne had been offside in the second half. Director Thorne's readout, which had been steadily climbing since the arm wrestle, spiked sharply. I checked it twice, assuming instrument error. It was not instrument error. The acoustic pressure in that room, generated entirely by unamplified human vocal cords, exceeded the output of the shuttle's exterior warning siren, an instrument specifically engineered to be audible through a hull. Gwen Pritchard, standing on a chair for reasons that remain unclear to me even now, was singing the loudest of anyone, one arm slung around Di's shoulders, the other holding a pint aloft at an angle that should, by any reasonable estimate of fluid dynamics, have resulted in significant spillage and did not. I checked. She did not spill a drop for the full duration of the song, which ran 4 minutes and 12 seconds. "This is a war chant," Director Thorne said to me, gripping the table. "I do not believe it is a war chant. They are working themselves into a frenzy." "I believe," I said, watching an elderly man near the bar wipe his eyes during the third verse, "that they are experiencing what our cultural files would classify as communal joy. It sounds like a war chant." I want to note that Director Thorne maintained this position for the remainder of the evening, and that nothing that happened afterward did anything to change her mind. The Matrix itself did not fare much better. I should mention, for the sake of completeness, what the singing did to it, because it is relevant to a recommendation I make later in this report. The Matrix is rated to process up to 6 simultaneous vocal inputs before accuracy begins to degrade. It began the song at 61% confidence. By the second verse, with 40-some voices layered across 4 harmonic parts, several of them deliberately bending notes in ways our linguistic model flagged as ornamental, non-semantic, confidence had fallen to 9%. By the third verse it gave up entirely and returned a single line of diagnostic text that I have kept, because I think it is, in its own small mechanical way, the truest thing anything on our ship said all night. Input EXCEDS parameters. Unable to isolate meaning from feeling. That line I did not correct. I am not certain the machine was wrong. Ianto, passing our table with a tray of empty glasses, noticed Director Thorne's stricken expression and misread it entirely. "First time hearing that one, is it?" he said, not unkindly. "Gets me every time, and I've heard it 400 times if I've heard it once." He did not wait for a response. He did not seem to expect one. He simply patted the table twice, the way one might reassure a nervous animal, and moved on to the next round of glasses. At 10:40 p.m., 3 members of the club, Gwen, and a much younger player named Reese, who I was told was on trial, and whose entire visible objective for the evening appeared to be not embarrassing himself in front of went outside to what Gwen described as the sled, to loosen up, despite the fact that the match had ended nearly 2 hours prior and no further physical activity was, as far as I could determine, required, scheduled, or in any way necessary. The sled turned out to be a scrum machine, a stationary padded steel apparatus, weighing, per its manufacturer plate, 280 kilograms empty, designed to simulate the resistance of an opposing team during a set scrum. I accompanied them in a research capacity. Director Thorne came as well, still holding her theory of the war chant, which she had by this point extended to cover all communal activity, pending further data. What followed I recorded in full, because I did not believe it while it was happening, and I suspected, correctly, that I would need to review it later to confirm it had actually occurred. Gwen, and Reese lined up shoulder to shoulder against the padded face of the machine, arms interlocked in a configuration our biomechanical database now has on file as human scrum binding standard. On account I did not fully understand. It involved the word engage, shouted by nobody in particular. The 3 of them drove forward into 280 kilograms of static resistance with what our force sensors, quietly deployed for research purposes, measured at a combined peak output of 1,140 kilograms of force. The machine moved 1.8 meters across wet grass. Reese, the youngest, the one on trial, the one who could not have been more than 19 Earth years old and whose physical mass was, relative to Dai's, almost delicate, was driving with a technique our sports science division has since reviewed on loop, apparently for professional interest, and described in an now note as structurally superior to material we have on file from 3 other species classified as apex-tier combatants. "Again," said Gwen when they finished, breathing hard, grinning. "They did it 4 more times. Nobody was injured. Nobody expected to be injured. This, I want to stress, was recreation. This was what these 3 humans were doing voluntarily at 10:40 on a Saturday night, for enjoyment after already having played a full competitive match earlier that day against, I checked the fixture list pinned to the clubhouse wall, a team from a town called Tredegar, which they had won against by 6 points, which Dai described to me, unprompted, as scraping it." Director Thorne watched the entire sequence without speaking. When it was over, she turned to me and said, quietly, "Add a note to the file. Revise the threat classification." "To what director?" "I do not know yet," she said, "but it is higher than what we currently have written down." At 10:58 p.m., during a subsequent scrum repetition, the 6th, I believe, though by this point I confess I had stopped counting with full rigor, Reese took a direct blow to the face from Dai's shoulder during what Gwen later described as a bit of a wonky engage, nobody's fault. The impact produced an audible sound our acoustic log describes as sharp, single, percussive, and Reese straightened up with blood running freely from his nose down over his mouth and chin. I began, instinctively, to move toward him, already calculating what medical resources our shuttle carried, and whether they would be compatible with human hemostatic protocols. Nobody else moved. Reese tilted his head back, pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, said something that translated roughly as a mild profanity concerning his own poor footwork, and got back in line. "Should we not treat that?" I asked Gwen, who was standing beside me watching with what I can only describe as mild professional interest, the way one watches weather. "He's fine," she said. "It'll stop in a minute." "He is bleeding." He's fine though." It stopped in, by my precise timing, 90 seconds. Reese did 2 more repetitions with dried blood still visible across his upper lip, then walked back inside, poured himself another pint, and resumed a conversation about a television program he had apparently been in the middle of describing before the whole exercise began, picking up, as far as I could tell, from the exact sentence he had left off on. I made a note in my log at this point that I will reproduce here in full, because I believe it is the moment my professional assessment of this species began to genuinely change. Subject sustained visible facial trauma, self-triaged in under 2 minutes without assistance or apparent distress, and resumed both physical activity and an unrelated social conversation without any measurable change in demeanor. Recommend review of baseline pain response classification for this species. Current classification, inadequate. At approximately 11:15 p.m., precipitation began. Our meteorological sensors classified it as moderate rainfall, 6 m per hour, accompanied by a wind gust pattern that, per the shuttle's own external hull sensors, was sufficient to have delayed our landing sequence by 4 minutes earlier in the evening on safety grounds. The rugby club held its social event in the car park. I want to be precise about this because I do not believe it will be believed otherwise. There was a covered clubhouse 40 meters away with a functioning roof, heating, and the bar Ianto was still operating. There was also, in the car park, no cover of any kind. And yet at 11:15 p.m., as the rain intensified, a substantial portion of the club, I counted 17 individuals at peak, moved outside, into the rain, to continue a conversation that, as far as I could determine, could have been conducted indoors with no loss of content whatsoever. Gwen was among them, so was Di. So, red-nosed and recovered was Reese. Director Thorne, watching from the shuttle's exterior camera feed, asked me to confirm that our translation of the word, refreshing, which Gwen had used to describe the rain, was accurate. I confirmed it was accurate. "They are standing in cold precipitation," Director Thorne said, voluntarily, after a full day of physical combat, describing it as pleasant. "Yes, Director." Is this species aware that weather can be a threat? I considered this question for some time because I did not have a satisfying answer, and I still do not have a fully satisfying answer, though I have developed a partial one, which I will present at the end of this report. What I can say is this: the 17 humans in the car park remained outside for 11 minutes. During that time, no injuries were sustained. No complaints were registered. One individual, whose name I did not catch, removed his shirt entirely, for reasons that nobody around him commented on, or appeared to find remarkable in any way. They came back inside not because of the rain, but because, in Ianto's words shouted from the doorway, "Last orders, you lot." Interlude: the tackle bags. Before the incident at the bar, and after the rain, there was a period of roughly 20 minutes I nearly left out of this report entirely, because I am still not certain what to make of it, and because Director Thorne has specifically asked me not to include it. I am including it anyway. She can file a dissent. 2 large padded cylinders, which the club referred to as tackle bags, and which our equipment database classifies as impact absorption training apparatus, civilian recreational grade, were produced from a storage shed behind the clubhouse. Di explained, unprompted, that these were used to practice what he called putting your shoulder in, a phrase which our translation matrix rendered, somewhat unhelpfully, as the application of the shoulder. What followed was a demonstration. Reese held one bag. Di took a run-up of approximately 8 meters and struck it with his shoulder at a velocity our sensors clocked at 6.8 meters per second. The bag, and Reese behind it, moved 1.4 meters backward across the grass. Reese did not fall. Reese said, "Nice hit," and reset the bag. I asked, Out of what I told myself was professional curiosity, and what I now recognize was simple disbelief, whether I might attempt to hold the bag myself, purely for calibration purposes, so that our physiological database might have a comparative baseline. Director Thorne objected. I overruled her, which I want on the record as the only time all evening I overruled anyone rather than the reverse. I held the bag. Di, to his enormous credit, asked if I wanted the gentle version. I said yes. I wanted on record that I said yes, and that I do not regret saying yes, and that our medical division has reviewed the resulting readings and described my recovery time as unremarkable, which I have chosen to interpret as a compliment. Even at reduced velocity, the impact registered on our internal sensors at a force our combat division later cross-referenced against known Asuvain threat data. The comparison they returned verbatim was comparable to a Class 2 kinetic training strike, delivered casually by an individual who was, at the time, still holding a conversation about a football match with someone standing 11 meters away. I sat down on the wet grass for a moment afterward. Nobody found this unusual. Someone brought me water without being asked. At 11:32 p.m., an altercation broke out near the bar between two individuals I later identified as members of an opposing team, present at the club as part of what I understood to be a post-match hospitality tradition. Voices were raised. One man shoved another. A third man, larger, intervened by placing a single hand on each combatant's chest and pushing them apart with what our force sensors registered as minimal effort. I initiated our shuttle's emergency response protocol. Director Thorne, to her credit, stopped me before I could deploy it. "Wait," she said. I waited. The man who had intervened, I never learned his name, only that Di referred to him afterward as that mad Tredegar hooker, which I understood to be both an insult and, somehow, simultaneously, a term of considerable respect, said something short to both combatants. Both combatants laughed. One of them bought the other a drink. Within 90 seconds, all three men were sitting together at a table, and the man who had thrown the initial shove was showing the other two a photograph on a handheld device of what I believe was a young child, to general approval. "That was a fight," Director Thorne said. "It appears to have resolved itself." It resolved itself into a drink and photographs of an infant. "Yes, Director. I do not understand this species." She said it quietly, and I want to note that this was the fourth time she had said some version of that sentence in the preceding 2 hours, and that each time her voice carried slightly less alarm and slightly more of something else. I did not have a word for it yet. I have one now. I will get to it. At 11:50 p.m., as the evening was, by every indication, drawing toward its close, Gwen Pritchard approached our table one final time. She placed both hands flat on the surface and looked at Director Thorne with the same expression she had used to assess the state of the 22-meter line 4 hours earlier. "So," she said, "you lot coming back next Saturday?" Director Thorne did not answer immediately. I want to note that this was, by my count, the first time all evening that Director Thorne had failed to have an immediate answer to a direct question. "You are inviting us back," Director Thorne said finally, "to your planet." "To the club, we're playing Tredegar again in the league in 3 weeks, but there's training. Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays always social whether there's a match or not." She paused. "You drink for free the first time. After that you're expected to put behind the bar like everyone else. You want us," a slight edge crept into her voice, "to contribute financially to your bar. Well, you're not going to train for nothing, are you?" Director Thorne opened her mouth, closed it, and tried again. "You understand," she said carefully, "that we are not from this world. You said that our arrival represents a genuine first contact event between your species and a civilization currently capable of interstellar travel. You said that and all in the speech. Very nice, that was the bit about meaning no harm." Gwen straightened a stack of chairs with one hand while she spoke, not looking at either of us. Question stands, though. Tuesday or Thursday better for you lot timing-wise? I know you're probably busy, what with the Empire and that. We do not have an empire, Director Thorne said. Whatever it is you've got, then. I want a place on record, because I believe it is the single most important sentence in this entire report, that Gwen Pritchard, captain of a rugby club in a town of approximately 4,000 people, on a planet that 40 minutes earlier had never made confirmed contact with a species beyond its own solar system, had, without any apparent recognition that this was in any way unusual, invited the crew of a first contact vessel to train with her team. Director Thorne looked at me. I had nothing. I will need to consult with my command structure, Director Thorne said, which is the single most diplomatically evasive sentence in the entire Asuvane phrasebook, reserved for situations of maximum uncertainty. Fair enough, said Gwen. Bring your own boots, though. We're not made of spares. She walked away to help stack chairs. We lifted off at 1:14 a.m. The clubhouse lights were still on. I could see, on our exterior camera, 3 figures standing in the car park watching us go. Di, Gwen, and Reese, the nosebleed long forgotten, all 3 of them raising a hand in what I have since confirmed, through cross-referencing 400 hours of additional footage acquired over the following weeks, is a standard human farewell gesture requiring no ceremony, no formal exchange, and no apparent emotional weight, beyond simple, unremarkable acknowledgement that something was ending and something else would probably begin again soon. They did not seem surprised to see us go. I do not believe they will be surprised to see us come back. I sat at my station for a long time before writing the formal report. I drafted several versions. The first was purely clinical, threat assessment, physiological data, recommended classification adjustments. I deleted it. It felt like measuring a hurricane with a thermometer, technically accurate, fundamentally incomplete. Di's neck came first, then the scrum machine sliding across wet grass, then Reese pinching his own nose and getting back in line. Then the singing, 4-part harmony from a room that had not rehearsed, that did not need to. Then Gwen Pritchard's first and only reaction to an interstellar spacecraft landing on her rugby pitch, concern for a painted line. Then 17 humans standing in cold rain by choice, calling it refreshing. Then a bar fight ending in photographs of a baby. I wrote the final version. It said, recommend immediate reclassification of Homo sapiens, subgroup designation Welsh, from Category 3 emerging species to Category 6, priority monitoring non-hostile. Note, standard threat assessment protocols do not adequately account for a species whose baseline response to novelty, pain, and existential surprise is functionally identical to its baseline response to Tuesday. Additional note, appended personally, not part of the official filing. Recommend Director Kaylee's Thorne be issued a full debrief cycle and reimbursement for 1 unidentified alcoholic beverage, consumed in a professional capacity, in the course of duty. High Command responded in 9 minutes. 9 minutes for a full first contact incident report with 41 supplementary data files, 3 biometric scans, and 1 recording of a spontaneous 4-part harmonic vocal performance that our own cultural division has since flagged for further linguistic and anthropological study, priority high. I looked at that response for a long time. Then I looked over at Director Thorne, who was sitting very still at her station, staring at nothing, holding an empty glass she had apparently brought back on board without either of us noticing. They invited us back, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Director. To train with their sporting club, voluntarily, as equals. It would appear so. She was quiet for a moment. I lost an arm-wrestling match to a man who described the experience afterward as good crack, she said. I do not know what that means. I have added it to the linguistic file, Director. Preliminary translation. A satisfying and communal experience, typically involving minor physical or verbal conflict, resolved without lasting ill will. That does not sound like a threat classification. No, director. It sounds, she said, like an invitation. We sat in silence for a while after that, the shuttle humming quietly around us, Penter shrinking behind into the general dark blur of the target planet's northern hemisphere. Brennies, from the pilot's seat, asked if he should log the trip as a standard survey mission or something else. Director Thorne did not answer immediately. Log it as ongoing, she said eventually. Contact established. Relationship undetermined pending Tuesday. That is not a category, director, I said. Create one. I did. It is, as of this writing, the only entry in the Asuvain Survey Fleet's official classification index under the heading *ongoing, social, voluntary, origin, Penter RFC. I do not expect it to remain the only entry for very long. I have already drafted the proposal to make it a standing category, applicable to any future contact event that similarly fails to resolve into either conflict or worship, and simply continues, unbothered, the way a Tuesday continues into a Thursday. I finished my log for the night. I wrote one final line, separate from the official report, just for my own record, the way Gwen Pritchard had once tucked a rugby ball under her arm without seeming to notice she was doing it. We have spent 14 years classifying species by how they respond to fear. I am beginning to think this one simply does not organize its world that way. I do not yet know what it organizes its world by. I suspect it involves rain and singing and pints bought for strangers, and I suspect that whatever it is, it does not translate cleanly into any threat matrix we currently possess. I have requested a second pair of boots. Director Thorne has requested a full set, though she has instructed me, twice now, not to include that detail in the official report. I am including it anyway. She can file a dissent on that too. At this rate we will need a whole folder just for her dissents, and I suspect, by the third Tuesday, she will have stopped filing them at all. I shut down my monitor. Somewhere behind us, already 400,000 kilometers and shrinking, the lights of a small clubhouse in a town called Penter were still on, and if I knew anything at all about Gwen Pritchard, someone in there was already arguing about whether the aliens would be any good in the second row.